There are threats to political inclusion in Kurdish regions. Of course, it's multifaceted. First, ethnic tensions with Arab tribes and rapid change of demographics are entangled with a fierce competition of resources in northern Syria, primarily, but also the disputed territories in Iraq. And the second, enduring violence and deep divisions among Kurdish rival factions have presented a challenge for the democratic prospects of an inclusive political culture. Finally, institutional structures are weak and most fragile in Kurdish regions. In the absence of a system of checks and balances, Kurds remain vulnerable to outside influences, as we all see nowadays after the fall of Kirkuk, or fall of the Kurdish referendum. But let me begin with the Rojava, the threats to political inclusion in Syrian Kurdistan. Being heavily Kurdish, US-backed SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, currently has way over 30% of Syrian territory in the north. In the Kurdish cantons of the eastern Euphrates, what is called as Rojava, Kurds constitute only a slim majority, 55%. In some places, such as southern Hasaka, Kurds rule over the Arab majority towns. And SDF's ethnic composition has long been a point of discussion in Washington, D.C. A controversy erupted, and U.S. officials provided conflicting numbers, pointing out that the Arab representation has increased over time. At the leadership level, however, Kurds still dominate the SDF ranks and pursue an agenda of indoctrination. An example of a recent graduation ceremony of 140 Arab fighters joining SDF following a 2 months training program. Pro-PKK slogans such as "No life without our leader," chanting Ajalan, and as a pledge of allegiance that happened. So ethnic tensions matter less when there was a strong coalition against ISIS. But now, in the post-ISIS era, we see unleashing ethnic competition, especially in northern Syria, over limited local resources. And one reason, and the primary reason, perhaps, is the oil fields. As we know, the Kurdish cantons include key oil fields in southern Hasaka. The Shadali oil fields, for example, are located predominantly Arab lands, and they're deemed especially valuable for Rojava's economic future. And we know that before the Syrian civil war, Hasaka and Raqqa provided almost 2/3 of Syria's total oil extraction. And oil revenue is already significant for Rojava's economy and will be a major source of revenue if Kurds can initiate transactions with Damascus via the original pipeline. And the negotiations with the regime may not be easy, but we see there is a shift in Syrian conflict dynamic, and there are some negotiations ongoing. But we know that the Kamishla and some other regions that is highly contested between the Assad regime and Kurds. It's not an easy task. During the 2004 revolt in Rojava, it was in Kamishli Kurdish revolt 2004, the Assad regime offered armed support to Arab tribes in Jazeera region, and they called the rights at the time. And we also know that in addition to oil, the resources include the food. We know that the Syria's food basket, the region is the northern Syria, and before the civil war, the region produced 43% of Syria's grains and 80% of its cotton. And the Assad regime did not invest in northern Syria, and we know that there were severe water scarcity in the past 2 decades, and of course it was part of the reason of the revolt, and it was certainly the reason for the Kurdish revolt 2004. But this the policy of food and fuel has not been very favorable to the residents, especially Arab residents in the region. And they have been very much exploited, and they felt this resentment for a long time. And of course, it will be also a key flashpoint in Kurds in the relations between Kurds and Damascus. Again, it's still the case, and it's unclear how the redistribution of the lands under YPG will take place. It's still mysterious future in the sense that the intellectually YPG believes in a communal system, a socialist revolution that could make a land reform, providing food and fuel security and education through local councils, and the communes take care of the most functions of a modern state. In many ways, it's local autonomy, but it is still a dubious future, and some local residents already began to raise concerns, complaining about the decision-making authority and the unaccountability of the YPG leaders. Of course, there is also criticism of the economic policies and strict budgetary control of the communes and its channeling of funds and humanitarian aid in exchange for recipients' loyalty to the YPG rule in the region. Of course, YPG's ideology may be appealing to anti-establishment Arab youth, those who are having resentments and having revolutionary feelings, but the ideology is particularly attractive to Kurdish youth due to its Kurdish nationalist favor, which does not resonate with Arabs, and this ethnic issue is a critical issue in near future. The Arab tribes' fear of Kurdish indoctrination and irredentism may be reinforced. As we know, there were highly anxious moments. It was in the region. We know the forced conscription of Arab boys and girls under the age of 18 by YPG, and also the memories are fresh in terms of the Amnesty International report on the changing demographics in the region. Let me move to the other side of the border, Iraqi Kurdistan, and we saw the rise and fall of Iraqi Kurdistan. Before the Arab Spring, we know the Iraqi Kurdistan was depicted as the thriving region, a virtual island of stability, and of course, many references to its secular character and immunity of sectarianism. But we saw right after the Arab Springs, it was the year in 2011 actually, we saw the first protests happening in the Soleimania region, and it was a revealing moment. The institutional fragility to quell the protests, the KRG approved a parliamentary bill and made some promises, 18 points of agreement between the government and the opposition. And including a promise for the structural economic reforms and fight against communism and corruption. The institutional problems, however, have remained a major problem since then. Of course, there were some institutional reforms, at least some measures of accountability in the oil sector, but the opposition grew big. They claimed such steps as being too little, too late, and Iraqi Kurdistan faced a major danger when the ISIS attacked Iraqi Kurdistan and threatened to intervene Erbil. And the war against ISIS caused not only a shrinking economy, but also a domestic refugee flow. Now it's internally displaced people, we know that now representing one third of the Kurdistan's population of 5 million. So mass outrage about the economic downturn grew as KRG could not even pay the public employee salaries properly and postponed, and repeatedly postponed, I need to say, presidential elections several times unconstitutionally. And of course, we know the basics about Iraqi Kurdistan. I have no time to go into detail. Please look at the paper. The institutional formation, the KDP and TPUK, two big major parties, and they are they're allied to rule the region. But overall economic system based on oil revenues and construction projects that favors a rentier state model, typical to Middle East regimes, and strengthening major party patronage networks. And of course, the critical issue in near future would be the change within the KDP. Now, the former president, Masoud Barzani, he is still the leader of KDP, And we know he is favoring his son, Masroor Barzani, in terms of the bureaucratic institutions, such as the critical institution of the Peshmerga, the military institution of the KDP. So we know that there are some divisions within KDP and also within PUK as well, and within now the opposition. That's why perhaps it's a very interesting moment, because the opposition has been pushing the government to make the elections, repeatedly complaining about this push, this postponement and so forth. But now September 30th is the election date, but the opposition is now very, very much, all these opposition parties, primarily Goran, they are very hesitant to go to elections, and the government now, the KDP, saying that they would do the promise, they would help have the elections, but most probably the elections might be postponed, according to some observers, internal observers of and they see there are some negotiations ongoing. Now the KDP has real advantage on this particular moment in which the opposition has been divided, and also, again, as I said, KDP also seeing these divisions within. It would be an interesting moment to see the near future of Iraqi Kurdistan, as we see some unraveling in Baghdad as well, the Sept and Abadi coalition. So it's still a turbulent, perhaps some turbulence. But how about the economy? Briefly, economic downturn and institutional problems. It may not lead to an economic crisis in near future, because the Baghdad's now not 17%, it was now cut to 12%. It's coming from Baghdad, and for some it's better, because there is some form of accountability perhaps, and also now they could still pay the employee salaries, and as we know, before Kirkuk crisis, after the fall of the referendum and losing the oil in Kirkuk region, disputed region, there was an alarming moment in terms of the economic crisis. What would be the case in near future, a total collapse or what? But as far as we see in the past year, it has been now institutionalized form. What we see in near future, probably there's no economic crisis coming up, but it may be a political mayhem and a turbulent future. And I'll end just with brief remarks about what would be Washington's, what should be the Washington's focus in terms of the Syrian and Iraqi Kurdistan. Briefly, perhaps looking at institutional issues in Iraqi Kurdistan, primarily long-term institutional issues and accountability, and helping Iraqi Kurdistan along the way in this long journey. And it has been the root cause of all these political problems, inclusion and the democracy, the lack of democracy, we should say. And of course, in Syrian Kurdistan, it is very much entangled with the policy against Iran or some other complicated questions. Now also having the Idlib question, the rest of the Euphrates. So the Washington's policy probably is very much focused on the short-term issues, but again, it could be the same advice if there will be a better advice from the think tank community. I do think it should be really focusing on the long-term institutional structures rather than short-term gains. That could help to think about the stability, which should be the key in the post-ISIS era for the Kurds and for the region's interests in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Okay, we have some time for questions. Let's say 3 questions, and then we'll ask you first. Mazen?
My question is to Nathan. I agree with the general arguments of the paper. Just I'm not sure that the first point regarding the religious authority in each country blaming the other is very much accurate. Like, for two reasons. The first is, of course, that of Sept, the legal issue quoted. Well, number one, to me, when he said basically, who told you this advice? To me, it would basically mean that he's claiming that the Muslims were Salaf for giving this advice. And secondly, it is highly uncommon, I would say even politically incorrect for an Egyptian pro-regime religious scholar to criticize Saudi Arabia by any means. This might eventually lead to him losing his office. And on the other hand, again, from the Saudi part, I think he was just the Sheikh you also referred to. I think he was again criticizing not the formal religious establishment in Egypt, but political Islam. So I think both were basically criticizing the sort of religious competition, okay? Because the Islamists mainly, the main argument is that they are the less corrupt religious scholars and they are better able to interpret religious text than the pro-regime clerics in those countries. So it has so much to do with politics and religious competition, rather than religious competition in the sense that even within the same country itself, rather than Saudi clerics or Egyptian clerics doing each other.
Question?
My question is also for me. Everybody's curiosity with that. I agree substantially with the evidence fact that Mohammed bin Salman is trying to eliminate or at least increase the power of the religious establishment as a secular power, the way they're bringing the religious police under control, the way it has been described to me. They're still in the streets at night, but they have to sit inside their white SUV with long faces because they are not allowed to go out and do anything about what they have seen. And and he's defined the religious establishment in other ways, allowing concerts to take place, the cinemas, all these things that look trivial to us but are a challenge to them. But my question is, by doing this, is he strengthening his position? And is he strengthening the Saudi state? Or is he de facto weakening? In the sense that he no longer has that support at this point.
One more question?
Yes. Me? Yeah. Okay. The question on the rise of representation of women, or on the representation of women scholars in Islamic schools, basically historically, what are the implications of more women representation? Do we care about representation for the sake of representation, or are there actually substantive implications if there are more women or teaching or issuing fatwas? What's the result of that?
Okay, Nate, you want to start?
Let me first respond briefly to the message. I don't completely disagree with you, and I wouldn't push you too much on that part of the argument. What I was trying to do is to say there's more than a contest of ideas. This is that religious publics within the two societies have an understanding on ideological and doctrine. There's something institutional going on. I would still say that I do hear an awful lot of this. Yes, he was probably criticizing the Salafi as well. But I've run into plenty who would say, well, why do we even have Salafis in Egypt? It's because all this stuff. This is not at the public level, especially post-2013. Pre-2013, you might hear that. But I don't. That's not a central part of the argument. I don't completely disagree. Especially post-2013, the leaderships are publicly respectful. In answer to Marina's question, I think my answer is, yeah, that's a great question, which is very helpful. But what I would say is, let me go back to my discussion on regime, state, and societal Islam. Yes, what is happening, I think, is that the control of the a state that was decentralized is becoming much more centralized, and in a sense, the regime is exercising much more direct control, and it's not just the regime, and it's not just the ruling family, it's one particular official, the crown prince. So yes, what I'm describing is something that really has to do with the solidification of the regime's control of the state apparatus. What that has to do with the strength and weakness of the Saudi state, that is an open question. And I'm not quite sure where the trajectory will be. What I would say is that, in a sense, it was this state's domination of the religious sector in Egypt that made independent religious movements almost inherently oppositional to each other. And something like that could happen in Saudi Arabia. Right now, the Saudi society is not really well organized outside its state. But if that happens, yes, you could generate stronger organized religious opposition movements in Saudi Arabia. That's not where it's going to go short term, again, because authoritarianism is so violent. But I think that is a possible side of it. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know.
Yes, so both legislatures and judiciaries often turn to religious scholars, right? If they have to rule on issues that are perceived to be in the realm of Islamic law. So the parliament discusses the increase of the official marriage age, or of course have to decide over whether maintenance should be increased after divorce. Usually fatwas are being consulted. Now, if more fatwas by women are being consulted, it doesn't mean necessarily that you have women representing women's issues, right? And in my fieldwork on Iran, I often actually see women also taking not positions that one would necessarily interpret as gender egalitarian, but I think the chances are higher. And we heard the talk by Mazen this morning, who said, if you look at the Egyptian parliament, some women's issues only come up because women representatives raise them. Otherwise, they are actually not even put on the agenda. I think it's really about that. It's about agenda setting. It's about both agenda setting and inclusion, right? I mean, women can participate in secular discourses. They can gain expertise in engineering and medicine. Why not also in Islamic law on a level that's by society accepted to be equally authoritative?
Two more questions. We'll prioritize questions to Miriam and Mustafa. Yes.
This is for Miriam. In Saudi Arabia, the education system is segregated based on gender. And a third of the curriculum of the school system is religious. And the state needs an army of religious teachers. And they fill it up with female religious teachers. And also in higher education, you have PG female religious scholar. And just 2 years ago, the Shura Council issued a new rule that they will allow women to be admitted into fatwa. And informally, these women are engaged in schools and outside schools, in fatwa, and in jails they are employed as preachers and stuff. So, how and we see this high representation of women in this education and research and religious, but we don't see these outcomes. So they don't adopt any more feminist positions regarding it. They issue the same rulings that regular scholars So my question is, we don't see this kind of change in perception or change in agenda setting while we have this huge amount of representation in women in religious in education and research.
One more question. Imad?
Yes, my question to Mustafa. We experienced in the past couple of years Kurdish drive toward independence, and there was a referendum, and this referendum eventually was defunct by Baghdad. So my question is, how do you see the relationship between Kurds and Arabs evolving, given the fact that there is a strong Kurdish drive toward independence? How do you see this federalism being developing in the future? Is it gonna be implicated, this relationship? Arab Kurdish in particular.
Yeah, That's the situation you described is mirrored in many other places, right? That women are trained actually to cater to the female part of the population. It's a segregated system, and that reproduces, of course, also that one responds to women's inquiries and is not starting to gain expertise in larger societal issues because one isn't consulted on these issues. So it's really about making available for women the kind of training that would allow them to be responsive to larger societal issues, and of course to develop the critical, that's the same for men and male religious scholars, to develop the critical willingness to address societal problems, right? And to really be, if it needs to be, also politically challenging in this regard. I can give you many examples on how there are parallel challenges in Iran. Actually, under Khomeini, women were trained at the highest level, and Khamenei just cut the highest level of training for women. So you have the same issue. You have hundreds of religious seminaries now where women are being trained to become teachers and to lead women in Hajj, but they're actually not allowed this highest echelon of training anymore, where they would develop independent positions that would allow them to challenge the orthodoxies. So it's really about curriculum design. I don't think, I would recommend policy-wise that much of curriculum design has to come from within, obviously. But I think if by reactivating these memories that women were catering to larger societal issues as experts in film, that will give important arguments to those who would like to push this agenda.
In terms of the ethnic tensions, if we like to look at in Iraqi Kurdistan, Kurdish versus Arab ethnic tensions, we need to look at the disputed territories. And it was the case, for example, Kirkuk, after the fall of the referendum, as we know, the change in Kirkuk was so quick, swift. It was not only due to the Shia militias and empowerment and the deals with the Shia militias and some officials, but it was also some sort of resentment in the community about Kurdification, and which was also mentioned by some organizations such as Human Rights Watch and others. In the past few years, the Kirkuk it witnessed some changes, demographic changes, and it was not only forced against Arabs, but also Syrians and other minorities, Yazidi communities as well. So the disputed territory, and which has been seen as the Kurdistan, the broader Kurdistan by the TRG officials, of course, has been a challenge for them as well because of this very reason about the ethnic issues and tensions between Kurds and Arabs and other minorities as well. So right now, what could be the future about disputed territories? We know that nothing soon will come about the official talks about Baghdad and Erbil for the future of this constitutional work. It's so free for a long time, since 2005, maybe over a decade, and it will be frozen for a long time in near future. So probably the community level, we might see some issues, Mosul and other places, which is still vulnerable to economic and other upheavals, social upheavals.
Thank you very much, our panelists. I want to thank all of you for being here throughout the day. I want to thank project participants for their presentations, our keynote speakers for being here and sharing their insights into the region with us, and audience members for being here throughout the day, and also POMEPS, Stephanie, for hosting us here. I want to remind you that we have publications available here and right outside by the door. You want to grab some of them. And we will be publishing more items on this project in the coming next couple of weeks. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
From the inside. Yes, there were people who perceived them that way, but if you think of yourself as being in the audience, for instance, for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's speech, and you're an Azhar Sheikh, and you're listening to the President of the Republic, whose training and entire careers in military affairs, starting to lecture you about religion, you think, well, what's next? You're going to go over to electrical engineering, Carnegie University, and start talking to them about semiconductors? Why are you trying to teach me about what it is that I do? So the view from the inside can look somewhat different. And what I want to be doing in this brief talk today is talk about several different ways in which Islam sort of expresses itself in these societies. One is what I might call state Islam. And when you think about the ways that a Muslim would encounter religion in one of these societies, it's very difficult to think of a way that doesn't somehow involve the state in some way. That is to say, if you get married in a religious ceremony, well, the state is there regulating and registering it. You get religious instruction in state schools where the Ministry of Education develops a curriculum. You go to the mosque and pray, and the state is regulating everything from electricity in the mosque, plumbing, to the sermon itself. Sometimes the content of the sermon, but an awful lot of the instructions of ministries of religious affairs are just telling the person who gives the sermon exactly how long they have to speak. So there's an awful lot. The state is just an enormous presence in the religious realm. There's regime Islam as well, and what I have in mind there is the attempt by regimes or by rulers to use religion to further sort of policy goals, security goals, or perhaps ideological goals. And then there's societal Islam, the way that Islam sort of expresses itself in society. There are various kinds of religious publics that are out there. Now, these are not hermetically sealed categories, and in fact, an awful lot of what goes on with politics and with inclusion generally is how it is that these three spheres kind of overlap, because they do overlap, but they just overlap in different ways. And what I want to do is to focus on how they overlap in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia. And let me begin here with two figures who kind of straddle the divide. The first one here is Sheikh Salim Abdul Galil. This is a rare picture where he is not completely smiling. He's only got a half smile on his face. Really, a figure who has a big public presence in Egypt. One of the things that he does is go on television and deliver like what I call an fatwa a-minute program. You call in, you get an answer. Okay, and I love these things for the same reason I love reading the advice column in Dear Abby or his successors, Carolyn Hacks or whatever in the newspaper. You just find what these people do is essentially answer questions from perplexed members of the society who are trying to figure out how to live their life in an appropriate moral or religious way. So he's a TV fatwa giver, but he's also so he's societal as well. He's also he's had a major position in the Ministry of Al-Qaf, the Ministry of Religious Affairs. He's a representative of the state as well. His television channel is known as the Azhar channel. It wasn't formally associated with Al-Azhar, but Al-Azhar being a part of the Egyptian state apparatus, he's presenting himself as kind of official Islam in Egypt in that way. And in terms of regime Islam, in the 2011-2013 period, he was sort of thought of as Fallulah's old regime. And he was even talked about, although he didn't get the job, as a candidate for Minister of Religious Affairs after the 2013 coup. So he sort of straddles the divide. And I'll just tell you something interesting about a program I once saw him on, where somebody calls in and asks about a complicated financial transaction and says, my friend told me that this is haram. And I've got to admit, I didn't understand the complicated financial transaction, but I did understand this man, because what he did was, again, the smile rarely dropped from his face, and he said, where did you hear that? Who told you that interpretation? He says, that's not an Egyptian answer, that's not an Azhari answer, that's not a wasati, like a centrist answer. The right Muslim answer is this, and just in that one quick series of phrases, he equated Egypt, Islam, Azhar, and wasati Islam. But the subtext was, where did you hear that? What he really meant was, you've been listening to some Saudi, haven't you? That's crazy stuff, okay? This is Isa El-Hayth, who again kind of straddles the divide. His father, again, I'm going to be looking at my teacher to make sure I don't make a mistake, was leader of the religious police in Saudi Arabia. He himself was a member of the Consultative Council, which is sort of a semi-legislative body, a consultative legislative body in Saudi Arabia. But he's also a bit of a public intellectual that he likes to mix it up in disputes, especially with other religious scholars, and taking what essentially would be a more socially liberal line. And I'm sitting in his living room, and he basically is taking the line saying something like this: we have great Islam in Saudi Arabia, and then all the Muslim brothers came in, and they got their crazy ideas. So in other words, what both of them are saying is, we had everything right in this country until we got taken under the influence of the other. They're both blaming each other. What I want to suggest is, I'm not a religious scholar, I can't quite evaluate these ideas, but what I want to suggest today is an awful lot of the differences have to do much less with ideas and much more with the structure of the state and the ways that these religious apparatuses operate and they were built historically. One of the most obvious symbols or presences in Saudi public life about the different role of religion is what's called, usually in English, the religious police, or the Committee for Enjoining Virtue and Preventing Vice. This is a body which doesn't have any counterpart in Egypt, and so there's something structural going on there. I'm going to come back to that body in a second. So if I want to focus on institutions rather than ideas, the argument that I really want to make, and I'm going to make it very telegraphically so I don't overrun my welcome, is that the states in Egypt and Saudi Arabia were built in very, very different ways. You have paths in Egypt, for instance, of much more institutional continuity. If you find an Egyptian institution, a state institution, you can often trace it back to the 19th century, sometimes even to the Ottoman era. There's a continuous history of state formation. There's also some discontinuities in there in terms of imperialism. The British came in from 1882. They declared a protectorate in 1918. There were the capitulations which gave non-Egyptians essentially extraterritorial status in Egypt. And so you have state institutions built up partly in the religious realm that are have this much more continuous history, but B, were shaped by imperialism and sometimes in reaction against imperialism. Certain kinds of legal or religious structures are sometimes built in order to wall them off from imperial influence. And of course, in Egypt, you have a state that seems to be dating back to the early 19th century in a perpetual state of fiscal crisis. So that affects the way that institutions are built. Saudi Arabia, you have a very different history of state formation. You have a state that essentially is built from several different segments. The country did not exist as a country before the mid-20th century. You certainly have, if you look, for instance, at Saudi borders, you will see footprints of European imperialism, but when you look at the structure of the Saudi state, much, much less so. The capitulations, extraterritorial status for foreigners, didn't exist by European imposition. There was some, I think, rough and informal echo of it, really because of the need to bring in foreign investors, especially in the oil sector, but nothing like the same kind of formality that existed in Egypt. And of course, Saudi Arabia, the Egyptians should only have fiscal crises like Saudi does. Again, there's tremendous variation in Saudi history, but you have a history of state formation that's very much informed by and shaped by the different fiscal bases of the Saudi state. And the overall result, I would argue, and I'll trace this in more detail if anybody's interested, has to do with generally much greater centralization in Egypt, which means that the religious establishment is the state presence in the religious realm is probably larger, more uniform, but also more centrally controlled, and that makes it more amenable to regime control. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, you have a religious apparatus that is definitely folded into the state, but that in the process folds in specific constituencies with it. It is much less centralized, much less sort of micromanaged by the regime. When Prince Mohammed bin Salman gave this talk about the need for religious reform in Saudi Arabia, and he mentioned 1979 as the year when things went wrong, a lot of people were kind of confused. What happened? I thought the revolution was in Iran, not in Saudi Arabia in 1979, but it wasn't clear exactly what he meant, but many Saudis understood him to be referring to essentially the way in which certain parts of the religious public were handed over control of certain parts of the Saudi state, like the educational apparatus and so on. So there's a much more of decentralization. Now let me go back to that committee for promoting virtue and preventing vice. And I said on the level of, this is something that makes two countries look extremely different. But think actually, or let's review very briefly the history actually of these structures. The idea that the commander, the ruler of the community has some role in promoting and in protecting public morality is common in both in religious traditions in both Azhari Islam and in the Saudi religious establishment. And the idea of promoting virtue and prohibiting vice being a ruler function or a state function is very much part of Egyptian history. There was a post known as Muhtasib, usually translated in English as the market inspector, but really essentially a position analogous to the Saudi committee that existed in Egypt well into Ottoman times. And it survives till today, or it survives certainly into the 20th century in odd form, in the centralized form that I'm talking about. So how did it survive? It survived in two ways. Number one, what if you were an orphan? Who was going to take over? There were things called essentially the Hisbah. This is the doctrine here is Hisbah. Hisbah courts that really oversaw. They would be courts for guardians. Courts exerting guardianship, but they were seen as somehow a religious function. They're a direct descendant of the task of Muhtasib. And of course, the second way was that individual citizens could go to the court. Most famously, most recently, in the case of Nasser Hamad al-Hussein, and say essentially an Egyptian intellectual who was taken to write a book that outraged some people. So some of his opponents essentially said this book goes too far. You have essentially left Islam, you have repudiated Islam, and therefore your marriage is not valid. And we're going to go to court to get your marriage dissolved. And they won. Now, after that point, after they won, the law was changed so that if you're an Egyptian and you see something outrageous like that, somebody writes a sequel to this book, by all means go to the state authorities, but you go to the public prosecutor who then decides usually to open a file, listen sympathetically, take notes carefully, and then close the file and say, go your way. This is decentralization. What has happened in Saudi Arabia, and this gets me to my last point, is essentially what I see the country doing is moving in an Egyptian direction. So what happened with the religious police in Saudi Arabia very recently was essentially the same kind of move. If the religious police see something that offends them, they are, by all means, encouraged to notify the police. They lost their power to arrest. So I thought they should be renamed the Committee for Promoting Virtue, period. No more preventing vice anymore, or perhaps the Committee for nagging people to doing the right thing, but they don't have police power anymore. And it's the same kind of way in which a bureaucrat, this is not an ideological change, this is not reforming religious discourse, this is a simple bureaucratic change saying instead of going here, you have to go there, but it's one with tremendous implications for the way in which certain religious publics, including basically the segments of Saudi society where the committee tended to draw its members from, it's saying this part of the state may not be yours anymore, or it might be defended. There are other ways in which, for instance, members of the judiciary are being recruited more widely. Again, saying to these to segments of Saudi society, this segmented Saudi state where you had all kinds of different fiefdoms, each of which was allowed to do its own thing, is going to be much more centralized. We're going to be establishing much more direct control, and we're going to be closing the gap between state Islam and regime Islam so that the regime is going to be speaking up an awful lot more and expecting senior religious scholars or the leaders of the religious establishment to toe the line. I was going to talk about how this was taking place in Saudi Arabia on the map, the courts. I did talk about the religious police. But my closing thought that I want to end with was, yes, in many ways, the Saudi society might be very, very different as a result. And it might be different in ways that would be positive from all different kinds of angles. I mean, it sort of depends on your perspective. But the unanswered question in my mind is what happened when these religious publics who felt they had a part of the Saudi state suddenly get told that part doesn't work anymore, or it doesn't work like it used to. Or we're going to start, for instance, taking people who have degrees in secular law and not just in Sharia into the judiciary. What happens to religious publics that have been formed in this way? What happens, again, from the standpoint of state regulation of religion, what you are seeing is essentially a step towards a much more authoritarian system, a much more centralized system, and a system which, if you were an Egyptian, you would step in and recognize a little bit more readily. The political effects of that, I think, are uncertain, but at least the first few definite steps in that direction have already been taken.
Thank you.